So in this DeBacco University video, I'm going to go over some trimming options. We're going to compare wet trimming versus dry trimming in this video lecture. Alright, let's go over trimming options for cannabis plant material, comparing the wet trim where you trim before you go through the drying process to a dry trim where you're trimming after a drying process. So looking at these options in more detail, that wet trimming is the entire plant's cut down and the buds are removed and then are trimmed. They're dried all in one continuous sequence. A lot of growers may refer to that as what's called bucking up the plants, kind of cutting down the plants kind of all in one fellow swoop there. Dry trimming is the plant is cut down and then hung to dry for a period of time, typically somewhere in the 5 to 10 day range, which is followed by the removal of the buds from the branches after the plant material has dried. Because you're going to be trimming those buds when they're dry, this is why it's referred to as the dry trimming process. Now getting in a little bit more of the pros and cons of each, if we're looking at wet trimming, the advantages of wet trimming is that it can complete the entire process in one continuous sequence of steps, from cutting down the plant to trimming the plant. This does reduce the drying space that's needed, so that can be advantageous for growers that are drying space limited. It also allows for a tighter trim since the leaves are basically flat at that time. There's less damage to the trichomes because they're not brittly dry. There's a little room for kind of handling air. Waste material can be disposed of immediately. However, the disadvantages with wet trimming is the process is time sensitive, as if the plants, we want the plants sitting around waiting for the trimming phase because the odds of mold will increase. And there's also less room for error with the wet trim. Some would also argue you also may produce a little lower quality end flower there with the wet trimming process, compared to the dry trimming process. Now when we're talking about dry trimming, it is easier to clean up. The trimming can be spread out over more time. There's also less equipment that's needed with the dry trim process. The disadvantages is there are greater space requirements to hang those plants during the drying process. The plant material is more fragile when dry compared to when it was wet or recently harvested, and the fan leaves typically still need to be removed. So again, keep that in mind. So that's a good little comparison to wet and dry trimming. If you want to learn about more of these in detail, you can search this channel. However, some growers are actually utilizing both of these methods. So how do you utilize both methods? Well, they're combining wet and dry trimming. They're removing fan leaves right before harvest to help reduce the labor later and speed up the drying process overall. The goal is to maintain the trichome quality by having the smaller leaves around the bud, called the sugar leaves, act as a physical protective barrier. This allows the best of both trimming options combined into one. Many commercial growers will trim wet just to remove some of the bigger fan leaves and then manicure the buds by hand to achieve that kind of boutique style look that many consumers are expecting these days when they come to purchasing a high quality final dry flower.